energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India, and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme.
Well, Caroline, I don't know whether you saw that polling about Rishi Sunak compared to Liz Truss. Quite surprising, actually, that he's faring worse. So this is a poll by JL Partners that says that just 59% of voters who backed the Conservatives under Boris Johnson at the 2019 election are still sticking with the party under Rishi Sunak. So it's down from 74% in August 2022 and the 63% in the aftermath of the mini budget.
No, it's pretty staggering. This is where you get a lot of the talk around the implosion of the Tory party vote, and Conservative Home polling also shows just how unpopular the Prime Minister is. I will say also, along with David Cameron, it's a really significant issue, and part of that is because of the threat from the right, actually.
Yeah, the thorn in Rishi Sunak's side seems to be the rise of Reform UK, this right-wing anti-immigration party that's been founded with the help of Nigel Farage. I have to say, it's kind of smart politically that he's been on I'm a Celebrity, raising his profile again. And it's interesting when you think of the wider context of the rise of right-wing leaders in Argentina and the Netherlands. And you might say, as a history student, that this is exactly what happens in times of economic downturn, and you might ask how much of that is the Conservatives' own doing.
Yeah, Richard Tice, of course, is the current leader of the Reform UK party, and he has talked about having net zero immigration, which I think is an interesting way of phrasing it at a time when net migration is at an all-time high, and that is seen as a voter concern. So kind of looking to that, obviously Reform UK was formerly the Brexit party under leader Nigel Farage. But yes, I think it's the times of economic stress. Having said that, is all really lost for the Conservative Party, or is there still time to pull back voters?
Yeah, the respite for Rishi Sunak are the unexpected, and this report by JL Partners says that there could be some help from the shy Tories. I love that term. But these are people who don't want to come out as Conservatives until they're in the ballot box. But that could, they say, reduce Labour's margin of victory, but it's not going to stop them winning.
Well, is this going to help? The Labour leader Keir Starmer causing quite a stir by saying that he admires Margaret Thatcher. This in a column in The Telegraph, where else, of course. I think this is absolutely fascinating, the kind of appeal that this Labour leader wants to have to either Tory voters or simply much more centrist. You're smiling, Lizzy Burden.
I'm laughing because my dad's a big Telegraph reader. I wonder whether it's gone down well with him. I'll tell you later. I've texted him, Caroline. So he's going to be the barometer, the very scientific barometer here. But I have to say, Thatcher cosplay is not a new trick. I've got photos here, a tweet by Tom Harwood at GB News. He's got pictures of Gordon Brown walking down Downing Street with Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair with her linking arms with him, and Brown heaping praise on Thatcher, headline in the Financial Times from 2007.
Yeah. Look, of course, I mean, I understand that it's anathema to those on the left, or particularly the hard sort of left, admiring Thatcher, but I wonder whether through the mists of time, younger voters, perhaps, that some of the bitterness around Thatcher, around the trade unions, has started to fade. And actually, she's seen today more as a sort of strong, decisive leader, someone who changed the trajectory of the UK. Those sorts of monikers wouldn't be bad for the Labour leader to want to aspire to.
And don't forget, there have been so many film representations of Margaret Thatcher painting her in that light, humanising her. Maybe that's how the young see her instead, rather than thinking about the unions. But we had the Labour frontbencher and former UK politics podcast guest, Pat McFadden, on the rounds this morning, and he clarified what Keir Starmer meant by saying that he admires Margaret Thatcher. Take a listen.
I recognise she won 3 times. I would hope if we were going to win elections, we would make change with the same determination, but not in the same direction.
Can I make a point here?
Go on.
When I was a child, my dad took me to go and see Tony Benn, hard lefty. And I don't know why, but I'm telling you a lot about my dad today. But my dad, I think, dared me to ask him a question, and I asked what he thought about Margaret Thatcher. It would seem pretty obvious, but his response was quite nice. He said, I admire that in politics you have weathercocks and road signs, and she is a road sign like me, but she points in the opposite direction.
Okay, well, that's a pithy answer, isn't it? Well, I wonder also the issue around Thatcher. In some senses, it's also quite a sort of easy thing to do, isn't it? To try to compare yourself. As McFadden was pointing out, the electoral victory is perhaps the thing that he admires most. Well, look, one of the reasons that the remarks were picked up on is because the leader of the opposition is making a major speech today. And so we want to unpack all of that. Starmer is expected to lay out his party's economic thinking at the Resolution Foundation's Economy 2030 report, and that is launching today. We're going to speak to the Resolution Foundation a bit later on in the programme, but first our senior economics writer Phil Aldrick is here to talk about the context. I know you're going down to the Res Foundation to listen to all of that, and actually a lot of significant people are going to be there. So how big a deal do you think this event is going to be? Is this going to really reveal what a potential Labour government might deliver for Britain?
It's important to say this is Resolution Foundation's work rather than obviously Labour Party policy, but they are a very influential think tank, and you have got Keir Starmer there. They do have close contacts with Rachel Reeves. Torsten Bell used to be a speechwriter for Ed Miliband. He runs the Resolution Foundation. So, I mean, you could say there are links there. I don't know if what they're setting out is going to be a blueprint for Starmer's policies, but you could definitely, there are things in there which are clearly look like policies that Labour could get behind. They want to raise, public spending on investment needs to be at 3%, they say, if we're going to fix. I mean, the whole point is, the whole message is we need to fix the productivity, the terrible productivity that we've had over the last 15 years, which is, our productivity is something like 4% better than it was then, which is just over 15 years dismal.
The report talks about ending Britain's relative decline. In place of nostalgia, we must mobilise behind achievable versions of the future. I mean, they're really talking about changing the trajectory of the last 15 years by doing all of those various things you pointed out. Yeah,
it echoes an event last week. So they had a productivity report, a productivity agenda, I should say, launched by the Productivity Institute, and I was on a panel at its launch last week, and really prominent economists on the panel, but also in the audience. So this conversation about productivity very much happening in Westminster, but there does seem to be a gap between what the economists are saying and what the politicians would be willing to do, whether it's actually palatable to talk about raising taxes enough to spend on public services, and that doesn't seem to be the message from Keir Starmer.
Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer don't want to present Labour as a party of tax rises before a general election. The resolution report does say higher taxes are going to be needed. They call for honesty about the trade-offs that are needed to get productivity back up, which does require public investment. You can't wishful thinking. I mean, they're quite scathing about what it appears to be the Boris Johnson approach to boosterism, where there's a lot of positive energy in the language and then nothing's really happening behind the scenes. They want this kind of much more managerial type of approach to fix things in this. And so investment is critical, but also the region. So we have this terrible gap between London and all the other cities in the UK, more or less. So, and if you look at other countries, they have the difference in wealth between the capital and the other major cities is much, much smaller. And if you could lift that productivity in those regions, then you get this productivity boost just as a result. And they do take this kind of slightly optimistic view as well. They say there is hope. They talk about the fact that we've had such poor productivity, even relative to other European countries, and particularly the US, that gives us a lot of opportunity for catch-up, which is putting a positive spin on pessimism, right?
Well, look, I mean, it is grim reading, though, when you read the report. They talk about slow growth and high inequality proving a toxic mix for low and middle income Britain. That they talk about just how bad things have gotten in the last 15 years. What are some of the other solutions then? I mean, is it all around a wealth tax? They also have some pretty harsh words for managers and the business world in the UK, that they haven't invested in the right places. I want to see a lot of reforms.
Yeah, they're pretty. So just some of the numbers which are striking is that 9 million. They say 9 million people have lived it through a period where there's been no wage growth, no real wage growth. Obviously, if you get a job promotion, you've seen wage growth. But had you stayed in the same job for the last 15 years, you'd have had no real terms wage growth, which is dreadful. And there's a sort of over £10,000 cost on wages, and people today are over £8,000. What they're saying is that if we get this catch up, we can be about £8,500 richer. The typical household could be £8,500 richer. In terms of the policies, they don't. I don't think they're advocating specific wealth taxes. Maybe it's a 300-page report, so I haven't read everything. But certainly what Labour want to do is they don't want to do tax rises. They want to close loopholes, right? And this is, so the obvious place to go and close loopholes is in what is called corporate welfare, right? So it's all these kind of tax breaks and tax reliefs for businesses. So, and I think actually it was John McDonnell under the Jeremy Corbyn years, he identified something like 96 examples of corporate welfare. I mean, most of these would just be, are vital, and there'll be things like investment tax relief. So we've just put full expensing in. So that's a piece of corporate welfare. But there may be some other little loopholes that you can close. But there's not. It doesn't feel like the opposition are up for massive tax rises, but they do have this whole agenda to try and get businesses to step up their investment levels, which is exactly what Jeremy Hunt is trying to do as well. And he did the full expensing. He made full expensing permanent at the autumn statement, and that is designed to actually increase. And the Office of Budget Responsibility did score it as a growth enhancing measure. And so Rachel Reeves says we will continue with that policy. So everybody's after that kind of, you get growth without any spending by getting the private sector to do it. That's the dream scenario, obviously. And so, if you do this extra public investment, if you can find the money to do that, then hopefully, you get the private sector coming in behind it as well.
Or you borrow. And that's the Tories' argument against Labour, that they're going to have to borrow so much money the economy won't grow. Does that hold up economically?
Well, this is what obviously the Tories seem to want to set as the dividing line, as the sort of battleground for the election. But Labour have been Labour have had their £28 billion green investment plan, £28 billion a year, and they then changed that to an aspiration to get to £28 billion over the 5 years. And I think they've kind of changed it to the £28 billion will come out of existing capital spending, i.e. they've just rolled back on this because they do not want to let this idea that they're going to be completely, play fast and loose with the public finances and let debt explode. Will they after they're in? If they get in, who knows? But that is certainly they definitely want to close that line of attack down.
And also in this report from the Resolution Foundation, they say, look, the green economy is great, but it's not the only thing. You can't rely on that for the economic growth of the future. So they're kind of also quite pointed in their criticism. You can't hang everything on the idea that there's going to be, a future sort of that it will be golden under a kind of green transition. So they're quite careful on that point as well in the report.
Finally, Phil, we were talking about the Thatcher cosplay. Do you think that this is just naked political triangulation, or can you see any real parallels here between Starmer and Thatcher?
Between Starmer and Thatcher,
economically.
Yeah, I don't know. I was reading a piece about saying how he was pretty tough as director of public prosecutions. Obviously, Thatcher was pretty tough with the unions. Maybe he's got this steely backbone where he can be utterly ruthless like she was. Other than that, I don't see any. I
think we have to shelve the word cosplay, though. That's for sure.
I have to say, Phil and I both used to work at the Times, and there is a wonderful Times cartoon by Morton Morland of Keir Starmer's face on Margaret Thatcher's body today. It is wonderful.
Okay, no sooner said than there you go, another version of cosplay. Okay, great stuff. Phil, thank you so much for being with us this morning, and we will eagerly await your reporting then from the Resolution Foundation event today. That is Bloomberg's senior economics writer, Phil Aldrick.
Well, to unpack that report we were just discussing is the Resolution Foundation's research director, Greg Thwaites. Greg, thanks for being with us. Your event today really lining up to be a big one. You've got Swati Dinger from the Bank of England, our very own Stephanie Flanders from Bloomberg. You've got Jeremy Hunt and Keir Starmer as well. Are you expecting Starmer to lay out his actual economic plan in proper detail?
So this report is about the problems that the UK economy has, and also the strengths that it has, and the need for a strategy, and describing the strategy that we need to make the best of this country and for the people living in it. The UK, first of all, we need to understand where we are. When we're a country in stagnation. We've had very slow growth for 15 years now. The lost wage growth that we've had is worth £10,000 off average wages, and we're now a country that's a lot poorer relative to our competitor countries or comparator countries. And it's also the most unequal large country in Europe. So we need to understand that that's affecting ordinary people's lives now. That's one of the reasons why the cost of living crisis was so difficult. But the country also has strengths. So we're the world's second largest exporter of services. And those are very broad strengths. So we need to play to our strengths, fix our weaknesses, and we need to do that for the long term with a clear sight of what the aim is. And the aim should be growth that includes everyone.
Yeah, I mean, some of the phrases that you use are incredibly striking. Britain's relative decline, in places nostalgia, we have to mobilise an achievable version of the future. One of the big recommendations would clearly be on taxation. I understand that this would be partly a political decision, but how would you convince people to pay higher taxes in order to help grow the UK economy long term?
So the first thing to remember, of course, is that taxes have already gone up a great deal, and we've got the highest taxes now for 70 years at least. And what we're not arguing for in the report is still higher taxes. We're arguing principally for better taxes, and that means fixing some of the crazy things in our inheritance tax system, our system of wealth taxes, capital gains. There's no reason why it should be less tax to be a self-employed worker than a salaried worker, for example. So the main thing we want from tax is better tax, not really higher tax. Now, there are some things that the government needs to spend money on in order to boost growth. But when it does that, when growth has been boosted, there will be more money available for politicians to decide whether to spend it on higher benefits or better public services or on lower taxes. So the politics doesn't go away, but if you get the economics right, I think the politics gets easier.
Let's just stay with the politics for a moment, because you've got a big lineup today. You've got Keir Starmer and Jeremy Hunt speaking. I was speaking to someone at an event in Westminster who was saying that unlike in 1997, Labour doesn't have its plans ready to go on day one. You're advising them on policy in a sense here. Does that hold true for you?
So we're advising anyone who wants to listen, anyone who wants to improve things for people on low and middle incomes in the United Kingdom. And I'm pleased to say, we talk to people from the Conservative Party and we talk to people from the Labour Party as well. Now, I can't tell you about Keir Starmer's plans. Keir Starmer's going to tell you about their plans this afternoon. But I certainly hope that it will include some elements of our strategy. But what we're trying to say here is that you need a strategy, which is a long-term plan that's clear about the goal and clear about the trade-offs, clear about our starting point as a services superpower, but one that's in relative decline, and address these problems strategically rather than with unserious quick fixes that we've seen recently. So people claiming that short-term tax cuts are going to solve all our problems, or that the net zero transition, while necessary, is going to do everything, or that just ESG corporate policies are going to lower inequality. We don't think any of those things are going to cut it. So the main thing we're looking for is scale, ambition, staying power, clarity about context, clarity about the goal.
You have accused the government of not being serious about its economic strategy, about the terrible fate that the UK has suffered, frankly, over the last 15 years. Have you seen anything different from the Labour Party? Is the quality of debate about the economic situation in Britain actually getting any better?
So I think there have been some really good decisions recently, and I think it's important to call those out. So one good decision was the decision the Chancellor made 2 weeks ago to lower the taxes on business investment. That's something we've been calling for a long time. And the aim there is to address a problem that everybody recognises, which is that the UK economy doesn't invest enough. So there are pockets of good decisions. And,
okay, but Greg, if you are a voter and you're trying to think about who to bring in at the next election, this kind of one side has done this versus the other side not too bad, that is not helpful when making decisions, to try to be very, very even-handed in this way. Are they both doing the right thing, both parties?
Well, neither of them has set out a manifesto for the next election. And when they do, you can trust that the Resolution Foundation will give you impartial analysis about what's best in those manifestos for people on low and middle incomes. Of course, we're talking about problems that the UK has had over the past 13 years, but the problems that we identify go back longer than that. And then there are also, some of the successes come from both parties. So I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I can't even evaluate the manifestos because they're not here. But what I can say is both parties could build their manifestos on the basis of the strategy that we set out in the Economy 2030 inquiry today in our book, Ending Stagnation. And both parties will be, their plans will be subject to our analysis when they become more public.
I was interested that one of the recommendations or one of the topics raised was raising the inflation target to 3% and letting the Bank of England cut rates to negative 1% if necessary. Do you think that BOE independence is at risk? It's something that the Lords Economic Affairs Committee said in its report recently because the Bank of England seems to have lost control of inflation.
I don't think the independence of the Bank of England is seriously at risk. What we suggest in the report is to change the remit of the Bank of England. It may be the case that if we go back to hitting the zero lower bound and having to do quantitative easing again to expand the economy, that might not work so well next time. It may be very costly. And so what you might want to do is to raise the inflation target. So you're starting from a higher starting level of interest rates and you've got more room to cut them. Now, that's not like an immediate short-term problem because we've got rates over 5%. So what we're certainly not suggesting compromising the independence of the Bank of England. We're suggesting looking again at the remit of the bank. I don't think the Bank of England's independence is currently at threat, but of course it's something that we need to protect and preserve going forward. And that's something that the report's clear on.
Greg, you talk, about policy, not so much politics, but policy, but also you lay some of the blame for what's happening in terms of the lack of investment in the UK on poor business leadership, leaders, also management. That's also been a criticism I've heard before, that, managers in the UK are not well equipped enough to make the best decisions. I mean, how much do you think business needs to change, needs to respond to the kind of crisis that you're, pointing at?
So I think business has to play a huge role because we're in a market economy. It's going to stay that way. So most of the investment that's done, most of the investment that's going to be done, most of the output that's going to be produced, most of the jobs that are going to be created will come from business. So this is all about making things, making business work better and making business work better for the whole country. Now, that, of course, means, amongst other things, management. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that there's a huge dispersion in the quality of management. And what we're suggesting in the report is to place more pressure on managers in British firms to invest and take decisions for the long term. Now, what might that look like? First of all, that's reforms to the pension system so that so that the shareholders who used to be the big pension funds in the UK once again place British managers are kind of under greater discipline and control because they've got big stakes and they can turn up and make well-informed votes at shareholder meetings and, if necessary, get rid of bad management. And then it's also about pressure from below, if you like. So we're recommending that large firms in the UK have workers on their corporate boards because it turns out that workers actually have a huge long-term stake in the success of the company. And there's evidence to suggest in European countries where workers have been added to boards, that it makes firms think longer term and invest more.
Greg, earlier in the interview, you mentioned trade-offs. Are politicians being honest about the trade-offs they face?
No, absolutely not. So I'll give you a recent example. The Chancellor did something great, which was to cut taxes on business investment. But then he also did probably at least as much damage by allowing public investment to fall. So it's all very well businesses being able to invest, but if there are no roads or power lines heading to their factories or their offices, then that's not going to be much use, is it? So equally, we need to ensure that there's as much public investment as there is private investment in the economy. And we saw one go up in the recent budget and the other one go down. So that's an example of a trade-off that was not well judged or even highlighted. But there are lots of others. So one is our relationship with the European Union, which has become, of course, very different over the past 7 years. And one of the things we're calling for in the report is a renegotiation of our relationship with the European Union, so that we have a UK protocol, which looks a bit like the Northern Ireland Protocol, but extends to the whole UK. We think that's the only way to retain large high value manufacturing in the UK. And we think that's achievable. That doesn't involve rejoining the European Union, but it is a trade-off because, of course, it will involve a loss of regulatory autonomy. Now, when you look at countries like Canada next to the United States or New Zealand next to Australia, what you see is that these countries tend to follow the rules of their bigger neighbours. And that may well be where the UK economy ends up. But that's a trade-off.
Greg, thank you so much for coming on the programme. Greg Thwaites is the Resolution Foundation's Research Director. It is an absolutely fascinating report. It is a long read. It is 300 pages. But I think perhaps highlights, this may well be this time a moment that we look back on to really realise the kind of coalescing around the concerns for economic growth in the UK, how it affects everybody in Britain, and just how much work the UK needs to do in order to change that story and to do better in the future. We're all suffering the cost of living crisis, but how do you change that? I think it's a very difficult thing.
As I said last week at the event in Westminster, politicians now need to make productivity sexy. It's been something that has been talked about for 60 years and Britain hasn't been able to solve it. It's a particular problem now, though. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Marifa Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.